So my name is Ed Finkler. You might have just seen me if you're here for the keynote. But this is a talk, how to be a great developer. And so slightly a bit about me. I'm the head of developer culture and also lead at a company called Graph Story. And we do graph databases as a service. Talk to me if you want to know about graph databases, which are super cool. That's what this talk is about. Anyway, those are ways that you can talk to me, like on the Twitter and email and stuff like that. But this is, again, we'll talk about how to be a great developer. And there's a basic assertion that I have here is that tech skills are dramatically overrated in terms of being a great developer. You can be an adequate developer or a developer who is good at some stuff and comes with a lot of caveats. But to be, I guess, what I would call a great developer, I think that tech skills are only one aspect of that, and I don't think the most important aspect. Now, it's not that they don't matter. Of course they matter. You have to know what you're doing. But they're really kind of overrated. And I would say that I think the things I'm going to talk about here are more important than tech skills. There's a level of course, technical competency that you have to have. But I've run into a lot of people who are very accomplished in terms of tech skills, in terms of programming skills, things like that, but who were, in my estimation, relatively poor developers because they didn't practice the kind of stuff that I talk about in here. So that's what we're going to try to cover. And there's really 5 principles that I kind of came up with in terms of what I think you need to do to be a quote-unquote great developer. And the first one is practicing empathy. The second one is practicing humility. Always be learning. Avoiding tribalism. And working to better your community. Those are the 5 things we're going to talk about today. The first one is practicing empathy. And just to be clear, so everybody is on the same page about that, when we're talking about empathy, it's not feeling sorry for somebody, or it's not feeling like, oh man, that must really suck to do that. That is sympathy, which is not the same thing. Empathy is this ability to understand how a person feels and why they feel that way. And that, I believe, is the most important skill that you can have as a developer. Now, it helps in a lot of other things too, but I think to be a really, really good developer, a great developer, empathy is the most important thing. And I think it's important that you practice that with everyone you interact with and who interacts with your work. And there's a couple different groups that deal with who interact with your work. Well, hey, I put it on 2 places. There are really 2 groups that you want to keep in mind. The first one is the users. Those are the folks who actually utilize your product. They're the ones who, the thing that you're making, they're sort of the end user, the customer. And sometimes that's going to be somebody who's completely non-technical, who's just using a tool to accomplish some tasks that otherwise it would either be slow for them to do or they couldn't do at all. And sometimes that's going to be people who are also developers or dev-oriented, depending on the things that you make. So some of us might work at places or create things that are oriented for other developers to accomplish stuff. So things like, I don't know, metric stuff or software as a service kinds of stuff, or like Graph Story, we're really oriented at a graph database as a service. Our users are going to probably be developers and or DevOps people or things of that nature. So they're going to be pretty technical. Now, other stuff that I made an open source Twitter client long ago, and that was an interesting experience because the people who used that were not technical, and they frequently did not care at all about the fact that it was open source or about like the technical stuff that it could do, or I accomplished this neat thing that you can do and stuff like that. And that you can swap out themes and make your own and stuff like that. They didn't care about any of that stuff. It didn't matter. So yeah, but those are really the two groups you need to keep in mind, is those users and the rest of your team. What I talk about is two groups. So you got the people you interact with. I talk about users. It's the rest of your team too. Those are the folks who interact with your work, but not on an end user level. Those are the folks with the stuff that you wrote, the things that you programmed, the code that you put out, the choices that you made. Both of those groups are the ones who are most affected by your decisions. So those are really those two groups that you need to keep in mind. Now about the users, something to keep in mind is that solving the user's problems should be your focus and not solving your problems. A key thing that oftentimes we see is I think we make decisions, and you have to balance this out because sometimes developer productivity means that you can get a product out to the users more quickly. Sometimes so you optimize to some extent for developer productivity. But at the same time, the point of most of what you're doing is not to make your life better. It is to make the life better, or to empower people to do certain things of these that they couldn't do otherwise, of the users. So those are the folks you need to keep in mind when you're making the decisions that you make. Understanding it and empathizing with the user is what allows you to solve their problem. A lot of times this can be kind of hard because we are typically, especially if who we're dealing with are not other developers, if the users of our things that we're making are not other developers, typically it is hard for us to understand what they are dealing with because the things that to us seem quote unquote intuitive, they are intuitive because we have spent a lot of time working in certain ways, working with computers for long periods of time, probably understanding why certain things work the way they do and don't. And the experience of folks who don't do that for a living, and when they work with the things that we make, is often very different than our experience. Things that seem very obvious to us may not at all seem obvious to them. Assumptions that we make about, well, of course you would click here, and you wouldn't click over here because, why would you click over there? Because here's a great example. Explain to somebody who doesn't understand how web browsers work, how they determine if a website is secured by a valid SSL certificate. So how would we do that? You could say, well, yeah, you've got to look for the lock. Some browsers don't show a lock, they show something else. Yes, there's a lock on the page. No, not that lock. It has to be the lock in the browser code. Does everybody here know what the browser Chrome is? Anybody? No, you really got to raise your hand. I can't tell if you're shaking yes or no. Okay, so the browser Chrome, if you don't know, that's the stuff that's the interface of the application part, as opposed to it displaying the web page. The Chrome is all the crap around the web page, right? So the back and forward buttons, the address bar, and stuff like that. Nobody knows what browser Chrome is outside of people who work in browsers and do web development all the time. Nobody knows what you're talking about. They don't understand that. Why would they? What is in their interest to do that? There's no advantage necessarily to doing that. They have no reason to know what that is. They don't know. And what does that term mean? It's this nomenclature that they have no experience with. It's like, I don't know, you're a doctor and you say, it's like, well, yeah, your lepizoid is having a problem. I don't know, what is that? I don't know what that means. You have to empathize. And if you can't really build things for them. You can't solve the problems for them. I frequently, my wife who doesn't have a strong background in IT, she's a very smart person. She's a very accomplished RN. She's actually transitioning into IT to work in an electronic medical record system. And she's going to be able to do it because she's smart as hell. But she doesn't have a background in IT, she's not a programmer, and she'll come to me and she'll just have to ask me. I something pops up, and okay, I say, yeah, just type into the search bar or something like that. Well, which freaking search bar? A lot of these browsers have like an address bar that may also be a search bar. And then on the web page itself, it may have 2 or 3 other search bars. A really good example of this is that, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, the Google result for Facebook, temporarily the first result changed from Facebook itself to an article in like, I don't know, one of those stupid internet property things like Mashable or something like that. Some article about Facebook. The first result changed on a temporary basis from Facebook.com to first article. The first result was this article about Facebook. And so what happened was, lots of people, what they do is they either they search for Facebook via Google. Now that might be they just type Facebook into the address bar, which if it's not Facebook, they don't type Facebook.com, it says that's on an address, and it then says, well, probably you're searching for something, so I'm going to kick you over to Google. That's what the browser does. Or Google's their homepage very frequently, and they type into that Facebook or Facebook.com into the Google search box. Imagine you have no background in this. How would you know the difference between those things? How would you know? How would you know that, like, well, what's a valid address and what's not? Like, I mean, does everybody in the United States get handed out, like, the RFC for what a URI is? I mean, you know, and why would you have that knowledge? It's very specialized knowledge that you essentially have no use for, except if you're building things like this. And I remember that there was this big thing in the developer community where they were like, well, a lot of people made all these. So what happened is on this, actually it was Read Write Web, it was the website that, and all these people start leaving comments. What happened to Facebook? I can't log in. What is going on? Well, look, all they know is, man, they type Facebook in. They get to Facebook. That has always worked. Why would I change that? And then something else comes up and they're like, this is not Facebook. What the hell did you guys do? And lots of developer folks are like, these people are so stupid. They can't figure out where the difference is because they thought they were on Facebook.com and it had changed, and isn't it ridiculous? You know what? Maybe the problem is that we made stuff so friggin' confusing and that only made sense to people who knew exactly how this stuff worked. And we just assumed that everybody else was like us. That everyone else assumed. Doesn't that seem kind of dumb? That's the kind of stuff where if you're not able to empathize with the user, you're going to make mistakes like that. Web browsers on the desktop, maybe there's a reason why people want to install apps instead of using websites on mobile, is because, especially on mobile, the experience sucks, it's super confusing, you don't know what to type into, and it's just a bad experience. It is a very bad experience. If you tell somebody, yeah, just type it in the search box, and there are 4 or 5 different form fields, 2 in the browser Chrome, 1 or 2 on a web page, how are they supposed to know? You have to be so specific. And you can't use words that they're not going to know. They don't know what browser Chrome is. They don't know what this means. You don't say, oh, look for HTTPS in the URL. What does that mean? I don't know. You know, there's no way to determine that, and that's how it's very easy to exploit people, because you have these very complex tools like a web browser that can do a ton of different things and visit lots of stuff, and it's really cool and really powerful. But if you're trying to accomplish simple tasks, people just figure out a way to get there that works, and they keep doing it. And so that's a big reason why people prefer apps, is because they just do it and it just works, and it's a lot harder to screw up and end up someplace else that you didn't expect. They're much more predictable in their behavior because they have a smaller set of things they're trying to accomplish. A lot of times, having a web browser and building, and I believe, my whole career is built on building web applications, so I'm not necessarily picking on this. But a lot of times, people want to do very specific tasks, those are the only tasks they want to do. And we just hand them a web browser, and we might say, oh, you should install Firefox, or you should install Chrome, instead of like whatever's built into the OS that might be kind of more tied in and tries to make it work nicer. Well, you should use this because I don't know, it's more extensible, like anyone cares about that except for us. And it's kind of like somebody says, I need an elevator because I need to go from floor 1 to floor 10, and you're like, perhaps you would like to fly this Piper Cub up to floor 10. And I guess it kind of works, but you're handing somebody like the most complex tool possible that can accomplish this, and then just assuming that they're going to be able to figure it out, and then thinking they're stupid because they can't figure it out. But I kind of think we're the stupid ones for assuming that our knowledge is going to be transferred to everybody else. That's a very dumb mistake to make that assumption. But as human beings, we tend to do that. We tend to assume that our experience is like everybody else's. And I think you can pass that on to the same things with, the people we work with. We make lots of assumptions about like the code that I wrote. Well, of course I understand it. It is comprehensible, therefore, and of course it's readable, and of course it's everything, and of course it works. Well, but that's just not true. Because you wrote it, you understand it, of course, because you knew exactly the choices you were making. But how do you confer that idea of the choices you're making onto somebody else? So that's why you have the other side of it is that, almost anybody who, as a developer, who goes and gets somebody else's code base is like, this is crap, we need to throw it out and rewrite it. Because they didn't know why those decisions were made. And they just assumed that, well, this person was obviously an idiot. There was no reason to make these decisions, right? Is that empathy? And it's thinking about those questions when you're like, hey, maybe I should write this in a way that is least confusing. And I should put comments in there to explain why, yeah, this is kind of a weird piece of code. This is why I ended up doing it. Maybe I could have done this a different way. So this potentially be another solution if somebody comes along and refactors it. Stuff like that. Code readability matters. Documentation matters. All those things matter. So when you're making coding choices, for example, remember that the person or people who work with it, you got to remember those folks who they need to read, understand, and extend your work. And so keeping in mind that, and maybe imagining, so what would it be like to be that person? Empathy. You want to make it clear why you made the decisions that you did. Why did I choose this option? Why did I go in this direction? Maybe it was because I was under a bunch of strain. I just needed to release this damn thing instead of, I didn't have a day to do it the right way. And I had 10 minutes and a bunch of people, I had a client saying like, freaking out. And it's like, all right, just get it working. We'll refactor it later if we have time. That's the best we can do, and that's it. And you have to make those decisions because almost every programming process and project is extremely pragmatic. So you do your best to anticipate questions. You do that by practicing empathy. Anticipating their questions and their points of confusion and addressing those through clear, readable code that's understandable. One thing is I almost always avoid ternary operators. To some people, they make plenty of sense. When I read them, I can't figure the damn things out. And I would rather write 4 lines of code most of the time than use a ternary. Because I think that there are occasionally times, very occasionally, that terseness is worth the potential confusion. I don't think most of the time it's worth it. And I think clarity in your code is far more important than doing things in one line or doing things in a terse way. We'll move on to the second thing is practicing humility. And this is one thing that I think a lot of developers have trouble with. Now the flip side is sometimes a lot of developers kind of feel secretly that they suck at what they do. I know I do all the time. But I think that there's another side of it where I see a lot of folks who can tend to be very self-assured that the decisions they've made, and perhaps at least publicly or externally, seem very self-assured in the decisions they've made. And humility really goes hand in hand with empathy. Empathy allows you to be a lot more humble because because it forces you to consider other possibilities and other decisions that were made and why they were made that way, and try to go through the process where, okay, what's the experience going to be like for this person? Why would they make that decision? Why would they make that assumption? Why do they have that behavior? If you understand those things, that is stepping outside yourself and assuming and saying, there's other people who have different experiences than mine and work differently than I do, and that in itself usually, to me, indicates that there's other ways of doing things and I might be wrong. So in this practice of humility, you have to accept and sort of assume this, that you're always going to be learning things and you're always going to be improving. And the flip side of that is you're also screwing stuff up all the time, right? And you accept and you own up to mistakes. And that's the thing that's hard for a lot of people. But that's a really key thing that I think you need to be able to do, is to say, hey, yeah, I goofed that up, that wasn't the way I should have done that. That's fine. But the less you fear being wrong, the more confident you can be, because it's okay to fail. Because you can go forth and say, I screwed that up, it is not going to be the end of the world, I do not have to be overconfident, I can make the assumption that I'm going to do the best job I can, but that I may make the wrong decisions, I may find out later that that wasn't a great thing to do, and I don't have to be afraid of that, I don't have to defend that, I don't have to be angry if somebody calls it into question. You just say, yeah, I can see your point. Maybe it wasn't the best way to do this. That's fine, whatever. You can always do a good thing. I'm always trying to figure it out. The likelihood is just remember that you are wrong about a lot of stuff. Everybody is. There's so much stuff I'm wrong about. I try to make the best decisions I can. I try to think things through. I try to make informed decisions. But even in something that I feel like I know pretty well, I know I'm wrong about a ton of stuff. Like programming stuff or making web applications, things like that. There's stuff that I'm just wrong about. I know that's probably the case. If I know that I'm wrong about it, I will try to work on it. But there's a lot of unknowns that are out there, and I don't know. And you try to make the best guess you can, and then it's kind of, you figure out what you can, and you grow forward and move forward. But so is everyone else. We're all like that. That's what human beings are. We can't, and it's what complex things are about. We're all trying to problem solve, and typically, the complexity of the problem is such that there's not going to be one solution that is obviously applicable to every case. So it might be there's, you trying to make certain kinds of decisions about stuff and say what tools we should use or what solutions should we pursue. Well, there's a lot of factors that go into that. It's like, how much time do we have? What kind of experience does my team have? What's the speed considerations, the performance considerations? There's lots of stuff that weighs into that. So if you go to Stack Overflow and somebody says, well, do this, well, that might have worked for them, but it doesn't mean it's going to work for you, right? So the best you can do is get some opinions, but you have to realize and remember, everybody's wrong about many or probably most things. They're probably wrong. It's very important to allow others to practice humility too. It is easier for me to practice humility, probably because I'm a pretty experienced developer and I'm a dude. And in a lot of cases, I have anecdotally, it's not been my experience, but I've anecdotally heard from people who are less represented in tech communities that they are afraid to reveal that they don't have the same kind of understanding that they are not certain about everything, or they're not expert at stuff, that if they show, you know what, I don't know. And it is important that through your actions you allow others to practice that humility too. That you're not judgmental, that you are encouraging of learning new things, moving forward, and that process of we made a mistake, it's not the end of the world, let's just keep doing a good job and do our best job that we can and try to nail it, right? So that goes into this third thing, always be learning. Always be trying to figure stuff out. There's lots of stuff we don't know, but it's a constant process of self-improvement. That's what we do. I mean, this should apply to everything, hopefully, in our lives, but it particularly certainly applies to developers. And in the constantly changing text, the technology that's available, new frameworks, new platforms, and things like that. And that's something to keep in mind about when we're always learning. Is I think it's really important that you were very liberal in learning about new things and new technologies, about new approaches and stuff like that. But I think you should be very conservative in using them. And when I say using them, I don't mean you do a side project or you do something just for fun and it's like, you know what, I really wanted to learn how to build a web application with Go or something like that, or I want to use Elixir or Elm is something I'm interested in. Elm is a kind of cool language that apparently is based on Haskell, but it's far easier to understand. That is like a totally functional language that I guess it will convert into JavaScript and run in the browser, but it's like next to it, there's like whole classes of errors you cannot make because of the way that it works. So I think it's statically typed and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, all that stuff. Elm's really interesting. I'd like to learn about Elm. Would I deploy Elm as in like the job that I have right now, build a web application in it? Yeah, probably not. And the reason why I wouldn't is because any technology can be the right choice or the wrong choice depending on the needs of the project and the strengths of the team. It's a key thing a lot of people don't think about. What kind of expertise do I have in-house? If you've got a lot of expertise, let's say in PHP, and particularly with like a particular PHP framework, like no, we build a lot of stuff like on Zen framework too, let's say. You have to make a really good, that there's an enormous upside to say, I'm not going to build this next thing in Zen framework. I'm going to build this next thing in, let's say, a very different full stack PHP framework, or you know what, we're going to switch to Rails, or we're going to switch to Django, or Flask in Python, or we're going to redo this stuff in Go because it seems exciting. Or you know what, we should really write it in Node.js because I hear that's super fast. That means you're sort of probably tossing out a big advantage your team has. And a lot of knowledge, domain-specific knowledge your team has, possibly to accomplish exactly the same thing you could do in something you already know well. Now, it might be some of those other technologies, it's like, oh, you know what, it is worth it to do it in this because we get significant performance improvements in this specific area. So that's great, sure. You just have to make that case. So it's the needs of the project, but also the team too. You know, you have to, so that's part of this. You want to learn, but you also need to be conservative about deploying stuff in production. And you don't want to be willy-nilly about that. A lot of people oftentimes are very quick to jump into stuff that hasn't proven itself to maybe like, is this going to be around in 5 years? Mm-hmm. And if it is around in 5 years, how stable is it going to be? Is there going to be documentation available for it? Like we write this thing and like, I had an app that I actually backed up the project. I was like, this is not something I should be working on. I turned it over to somebody else, but it was a little side project. And it was written in an old version of PHP. And it was, I think the documentation did still exist, but it was very hard to find. And I wasn't particularly familiar with Cake. I mean, I've written with a lot of MVC frameworks, so it wasn't like alien to me, but the way that they do stuff is kind of specific to that framework. And the docs are really hard to find. And let's say I want to go talk to people about, you know, the amount of support you can get from the community around a technology stack is really key in being able to be productive in it and getting up to speed quickly. And if that community has moved far on from the technology that you build it in, they might not have any hope for you there. I see this all the time. Like, I'll just say, JavaScript is going through a period right now where they are iterating so friggin' fast on stuff that I think somebody made a joke, but it's true too. He was in this huge rant about the state of web development, and he seemed to assume the state of web development was essentially just JavaScript. But he goes on this big rant about it, and it was like, what they should do in universities is that they should make every computer science student build an application in Node.js, and then go back 3 months later and try to update all their dependencies. And he said, the only problem with that is that you would get no graduates from computer science. And I'm not just picking on, I mean, look, it's an exaggeration. I've written some stuff in Node or used, some JavaScript tooling stuff that's very effective, but it is very hard to feel super confident that these tools are going to work exactly the way they are 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And I've been doing this 20 years, and applications last a lot longer than we expect, unless our attitude is we're just doing a year at a startup and we switch every year, and it really doesn't matter what we're going to do because it's just a turnover so fast. Well, I'm not really interested in building stuff like that, and that's just not the approach that I've had for that kind of stuff. I think it's important in this process, though, of learning, is that you set aside a little time each week to learn about some new tech. And that might just be libraries in the tech stack you're familiar with, like PHP or Python or Ruby or Go or Perl or whatever. And one of the things that I help is even just subscribing to like one of these weekly aggregation newsletters. Like there's a PHP weekly, Python weekly, JavaScript weekly, all these things. Basically, it's like, hey, here's some articles that are interesting. And the thing I usually skip to, because I'm not super interested in the articles, and sometimes there's something interesting, but a lot of times it's kind of stuff I don't really care about. But I usually go back, it's like, here's some libraries that were released that we noticed. And I go through that, and it's like, oh, hey, there's someone that does cool stuff. I should keep that in mind, check it out. Well, that's a process that, I mean, it gives me a real good return on my investment in terms of finding out new things that I wasn't aware of before. I don't have to spend a ton of time doing it. It's a curated thing. It comes to me, and I don't have to go search it out. And I think that if you go to conferences, like apparently most of you do, you should try to catch a couple talks about stuff that you're just not familiar with. And you don't necessarily, maybe you're interested in it, maybe you're not. One of the things I really like is if I have an opportunity to go to a conference like OSCON, the O'Reilly Open Source Conference, is that, which is super expensive. That's the drawback with it. But one of the things you get is that, like, I went to this talk about like how they were using stuff. I can't remember what it's called, but it was like an OpenGL-based UI library that they were using for some Linux stuff, and I was like, that's really cool. It was neat to read that. I learned stuff from it, or like things about I went to go Perl, look to a Perl talk about what's going on with Perl, and like here's an intro to doing some Python stuff, and you pick up new things that you don't have experience with, and it really kind of broadens, I think, your mindset about different ways of doing things. And you may understand all of it, and you may not, and that's fine. But it gives you sort of an introduction to this stuff. Like if you're like, oh, I love MongoDB, you should go to a graph database talk, or go to like something about SQL and learn about what's going on with that stuff. Like, well, okay, so what's new with like the JSON type in MySQL? Maybe you'll learn some things. Maybe that's something that would be better and applicable to some project you're working on. I think the fourth thing is avoiding tribalism. And I think it's really important that we're kind of tribal people. As human beings, we're kind of tribal creatures, and we tend to want to be in tribes and feel safe in those. But I think it's really important when it comes down to being a developer that you refuse to participate in tribalism, because you should be making your decisions pragmatically. And tribalism typically is the antithesis of pragmatism. So yeah, we're social animals. Being part of a group gives us confidence, helps us feel safe. But when you kind of get warring over technology choices, that distracts us from doing good work, making pragmatic decisions, and practicing empathy. Tribalism actively works against being empathetic to people who have different experiences and have made different choices. I think it's really important that, and for some reason, I decided to change my slides last minute, which wasn't great. But I think it flows better, but unfortunately I forgot a couple things. But one of the things I didn't talk about in here, what's going to come up, we did it in the wrong order, that's what it is. Second thing I want to say is building communities. You want to build communities with what we have in common. So that's great, that's awesome, that's what we want to do. But you want to also, at the same time, a value of that is embracing the diversity that makes each one of us unique, and having different backgrounds and different perspectives, and making different choices. And it's very important to make those safe places for anyone who's interested in participating. And I was going to say that, well, if I screwed this up, I have to go back and where did I go? Repeating. And there's something that kind of goes along with tribalism that you see all the time, is this idea where people make absolute statements. And they say, absolutely, this is better, this is worse, this is crap, this is good, etc., etc. Whenever somebody makes a statement like that, you should be extremely skeptical of them.
Yeah, opinionated, lets you choose the technologies easier.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to say this is the best tool because there isn't another tool, that's kind of, that will come across as very absolute.
Yes.
And I worry whether people will add more skepticism to that because I'm so sure of what I think is right. But I definitely use absolute more than I could.
So, and the reason why I say it is this. I think it is okay to say that, in my experience, this has worked better for me, and that's why I made those decisions. An absolute statement says, in all cases, this is a better solution than, X is a better solution than Y. And it is not possible for a human being to anticipate all situations. I'm talking about the difference between objective truth and subjective opinion and experience. I cannot objectively say, in all cases, this X technology will be better than Y technology. I do believe that people make their choices, and oftentimes there are certain choices that are better in certain circumstances. But I think it is an aspect of lazy communication and falling into tribalism when we make a statement like, X is better than Y. Like, oh, why did you build that in Rails? That sucks. Or why did you build that using Symfony? That sucks. I don't like Symfony. Don't like the framework. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for my brain. Doesn't mean it sucks. Lots of people use it. Apparently very productive with it. That's fine. That's just not the way I like to work. And so I can't say, well, Symfony, so I like, the framework I use the most is Slim. And I cannot say Slim is better than that because that's not true. Slim is better than Symfony. That's simply not true. The only thing I can say is, in my experience, I feel more productive and enjoy working with Slim more than I do with Symfony. And that is entirely valid, and that's entirely for the point. But you cannot make assumptions about what other people are, the experiences are going to be. Well, you can, but I think it's a false assumption. So that's why I say avoid and be very skeptical about absolute statements. And I see people make absolute statements and then say, well, obviously I didn't mean that. Of course it's an opinion. Well, I don't know. I can only tell the words that are coming out of your mouth. And the words that you said were absolute. If you meant it was an opinion, say, it's my opinion that this, and that's it. Because these are complex things. This is not a thing, this is not a Boolean. This is not something that's a very simple situation. Building applications and doing development has a very large set of criteria determining what's a good choice and what's a bad choice. And often there's just way too many variables to make there's absolutely obviously a best decision. You just go with what you hope is the best decision. Sometimes that's your gut, but really what your gut is my experiences kind of leads me to this direction. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. You do the best you can, but you realize that there's a good chance that you might be wrong about it too. So that humility falls in with that. So when you see other people making, someone who is practicing humility and empathy is probably going to be very resistant to making absolute statements just because they know that that things are different in lots of different situations. So that's why I tend to, like, do I get really upset about it? I try not to. I try to say, well, I said this, but probably what he means is this, and that's fine. But that is also the reason why I don't participate in communities that tend to do that a lot. I don't go on Reddit. People will sometimes be like, read this discussion on Reddit PHP. I'm not going to go there because I find it unpleasant. And it just makes me mad, and I'm upset about enough stuff already, and I don't need to get mad about that. So if that's an example, is that I think that as our communities and ourselves, we want to avoid that kind of stuff because that's not really how the world is. That's not really how it works. So anyway, that's my thinking about it. If it's an opinion, make it clear it's an opinion, right? And make it clear that that applies to me, and I'm just figuring out the best I can.
Well, in my experience, that was a great answer.
Okay, very good. See, I like that. And maybe it's gotta make these actually roll out the right direction next time. So a big thing is that dismissing it, and this goes hand in hand with absolute statements, dismissing a technology without a sound, reasonable argument is lazy and it's prone to error, and we're wrong about a lot of stuff anyway, so let's not make more mistakes, right? So I think it's really, really you have to be really, really careful about participating in X versus Y arguments, because I think most of the time they're just a waste of your time. Sometimes you can have nuanced discussions, and I will ask somebody who I know is going to give me a varied and well thought out response. Like I asked Justin Carmody, okay, what kind of differences do you see between, he was talking about using Beanstalk, but had mentioned Gearman in his talk about processing queues and processing, asynchronous processing PHP. And we were using Gearman and using Beanstalk. And I was like, can you give me a little bit of comparison between Beanstalk and Gearman? Because I know he is probably not going to say, well, Beanstalk just kicks ass, bro. You know, and that's not going to be, he's going to tell me, this is why I think it works. These are some of the things that you don't get with Beanstalk, and this is why we chose it. Okay, I can take that, and I can take that information and apply it to other stuff. But you know what? I see a lot of people, as a musician, I do music stuff sometimes. As a musician, I ran into a lot of people who had great gear and awesome stuff and love to argue about equipment. They love to argue about equipment, but barely ever finish a song. Barely ever. Folks who spend a bunch of time fighting about that are usually getting the least done. So, and a key thing with tribalism, I know I'm running a little long because I got chatty, is really reserving your loyalty for people. People are the ones that deserve your loyalty, not brands, not companies, and not technology. That's why I really don't like it. Like, I don't like it when there's a word for this, and I can't remember what it is. But like, I don't like being identified as like if I was doing Ruby, I would not like to be identified as a Rubyist or a Rails guy or when I do it, a PHP person or things like that. I use it for reasons that I've figured out. I use the technology that I choose. But I don't like being part of it. I don't like being identified like that. I don't like being part of that tribe. I don't necessarily have a great deal of loyalty to it. I mean, it's hard. I've been doing PHP for like 17 years, and it's hard not to have some emotional connection to that and to the community that's in it. But the community is people. That's not the technology. There's lots of stuff in PHP that sucks, right? Well, I ignore that stuff and I use the stuff that works, and so I don't have any great loyalty to going around telling everybody it's the greatest thing to shop liver. We had a good discussion with a guy last night who hadn't worked with PHP, but he has got a PhD in some computer science crap, like computer language stuff and things like that. And he does most of his stuff in Scheme and other Lisps. And he was like, I don't know anything about PHP. All I know is that when I got my PhD, everybody said, don't ever use PHP. And I was like, all right. Well, and so, and I had a little more, a few of us had to, kind of explain that to him. But but I kind of broke down because I was like, really the reason I told you that is because from an architectural standpoint, it's a poor language. It is inconsistent, it is all tossed together, there's lots of issues with it from an architectural language design level. But I explained this is why it ended up that way, because it has a different process than it did for a lot of the languages like Python or Ruby or things like that. You don't have a single, dictator who kind of says, this is how we're going to do things. So it was designed anarchically by tons of groups that have come and gone. And the second thing is, okay, so why do you keep using it? I said, because it solves my problems well. It solves most of the problems that I work with pretty well. If there's something that comes along, it solves my problems better. In certain cases, I use that. And that's one of the things I like about the PHP community is that it tends to be pretty pragmatic. So I'm not loyal to companies, I'm not loyal to technologies, I'm not loyal to brands. I'm loyal to people, and that's the only thing that really deserves that loyalty. If you're interested in solving problems, each piece of tech is just a tool. Some tools might work better than others for you, but a big thing is fashion-driven development where it's like, this is a new super thing. It's like, we have to rewrite all of our UI in React, which, hey, I don't know, maybe that works great, maybe it doesn't, whatever. Lots of people jump on that. But my experience is that kind of like fashion-driven development, that just never stands up. And 5 years, 10 years down the road, it's going to be a mess, man. It's going to be legacy apps that are written in a relatively young thing, in a relatively young language. Very rarely have the kind of support that you need 5 years down the road to keep it going. So the fifth thing that I think is a really important part of being a great developer is bettering your community. And the key thing here is that you're thinking about making people's lives better with your skills. Hopefully you get to do that in your job in general, and you do in small ways and big ways. Sometimes you empower people to do stuff that they couldn't be able to do otherwise. That's what technology is good at. But you're working on making the community around you better. And that community does not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to migrate to Mecca on the island of San Francisco or Brooklyn or what have you. You don't have to go to some magic city and tech genius to do important work that influences people's lives. Don't worry about, for example, how many people use what you make. That is not a metric that you should be using for like, well, what good did I do with my life or not. Empowering, say, 5 people is really incredibly special. And they are all going to remember what you did for them because you did this stuff that made their lives a lot easier. It doesn't matter where you are, too. Talking about like you don't have to be in some magic place. What matters is the difference you make in people's lives. And this is the internet, so the people who are around you might be on the other side of the world. I mean, doesn't depend. It varies. But what matters is the difference you make in the lives of people around you. I think it's really important as a great developer, if you're comfortable with this, and then find the ways that you are comfortable with this. It's like share what you learn with the people around you and you ask them to share what they have learned with you. That's what's so great about open source communities, to me, is that process of shared learning, of collaborative learning. That's really cool. And that's what sets it apart from non-open source communities to me. You find other people doing stuff like you, and you share those things with them. And that can be, you can do things like talks, it could be blogging, it could be screencasts, just be having conversations with people who are doing stuff. And so you don't have to go out and like do these magic things, get your brand up and all that stuff. You can just have conversations with people. Sit down and have coffee, maybe start a little meetup and have some coffee with them. That's really valuable, and that is, in the same way, collaborative learning. That is an informal mentoring process in the make, just the way that, that you talked about in the keynote yesterday. And I will say, the more you can do that, it's really, really helpful career-wise. I never intended to send out that way. I'm just really chatty and like to talk about this stuff. And I like to talk about what I'm learning and doing, and it's just this thing I have. But my career has unintentionally benefited massively from this because that's something that I do. So I didn't set out to do it. I just did it because I like doing it. but it has helped a ton. And even just having conversations with people, I hate this word, but it's networking. It's getting people to know you, and most of the jobs you get are from people you know. That is statistically, you don't get a lot of cold hires. It's from people that you find out about jobs from. So, now one thing you might go into, I don't know, how many people here do any kind of supervisory work? Like they lead a team, anybody here? Okay, so we got a few, great. So great managers need, or excuse me, great developers, they need a great organization to support them. The values of any kind of hierarchical organization distribute from the top down. And typically, if there's not a hierarchy, no matter what, a hierarchy will form, an intentional one or an unintentional one. It does form. So when we're talking about these kinds of values, supervisors on all levels have to be consistent about adopting these kinds of things and applying these kinds of values. So managers need to be prepared to practice these things and defend those practices, because sometimes there's pushback on that stuff. Sometimes practicing humility, admitting that you're wrong might not be popular, and you need to be in a position where you're enabling people to do that, where you're creating an environment that you can do that in. You have to deal with individuals who don't practice those things too. So then you gotta take them aside and try to set that. A lot of times you set it with examples, and people who tend to be good or more mouthy, like I am, it tends to then, the things that you practice, oftentimes that helps other people adopt those kinds of things too. But you need to sometimes deal with folks who don't practice that. And that's really key for just saying, this is how we need to interact with each other. We need to be supportive of each other. It is much easier to be angry or negative. It is much easier to do that. And it is important, very important, that you practice empathy and enforce those practices by example and by procedure. The way that you choose to do things has to be informed by that stuff. Am I encouraging and allowing people to be empathetic and humble and always be learning and bettering their community and avoiding tribalism? Am I doing those things? Am I encouraging those things? Am I allowing those things to happen? And I think a key thing about that is you end up talking less and you listen more and you ask in order to understand. You don't ask with an answer that you want necessarily. You ask to understand. So that's what I got. We don't have a ton of time. There's a joined in link, Talk EB 108. Does anybody have a quick question? Otherwise, I can chat with you after. Yeah, please go ahead.
You talk about developers having empathy for users and others. What are some things we can do to help build empathy for developers within an organization? And I'll give you the two things I see most often. That being the idea that developers are a commodity, double the number of developers, double the progress. And the second being, when dictating new features or new products, failure to, understand the trade-offs you're asking developers to make and the decisions that have to go through after, other shareholders leave the room.
Yeah, real great questions. I would say that I think it helps a lot. There are some things you can do, I think, to help with that. I'm not an expert in sort of organizational psychology and things like that, but I think I can say that the more that you are able, that people have opportunities to experience and spend some time around other folks and the way that they have to work and understand the choices they have to make every day, I think that helps a lot. I think typically, a lot of times, folks aren't necessarily able to be empathetic because they just have no idea what it's like. And I think maybe, and I'm just kind of spitballing, but opportunities to sort of introduce folks into working a little more closely and understanding the choices that they make, even kind of maybe observing a little bit and spending that time, I think is helpful. the thing I'll say, and I think I'm being realistic, but I don't think I'm being pessimistic, I'm being realistic, is that organizations that ask engineers to do lots of stuff, but don't have the values of empathy, trust, and humility across the board, from the top down, they're always going to have trouble with that. Because what they're doing is they are assuming that their experience is correct, and assuming that they have full understanding of what, say, a developer's experience is, and also not trusting a developer to make good decisions, and that what they're telling them is what's really the case. So sometimes you have to kind of help people encourage that. You might have a supervisor who's more willing to step up and say, hey, you trust me, I'm going to tell you this. This is why, say, asking them to do X, Y, or Z doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of this, and you got to sit down and explain to them and try to help with them and try to help them understand that. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I've been lucky to work on a lot of what I would call engineering teams. And typically those are ones that respond better because they have a better understanding of what's going into the work. But you're also going to run into some folks who are just like, I just don't believe it, you should be able to do it. And I've certainly seen that too. And I think that's always going to be tough at some organizations if people who are in top levels simply don't value those things and don't share those values. I think it's always going to be tough. You can't really make somebody decide to be humble or empathetic, right? So I don't have a lot of, like, say, organizational, these are practices you should do for that, and this is a key thing. But I think the best thing you can do is think about ways where you can try to have opportunities to gain understanding of what each other's things are. You know, okay, so why are you asking me to do this? I want to understand what your pressures are, and you should come to me and talk to me about what my pressures are, and what are the things that I have to deal with, and why it's hard for me to answer your question of how long it's going to take, right? So, in general, that's what I'd say. In practice, I think that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So, we're probably going to go past time, but thanks for coming. I appreciate it.